I am very glad to introduce you to Mark Algee-Hewitt, who is holding this seminar today. He's a professor for digital humanities and English at Stanford University and directs the Stanford Literary Lab, a research group that combines computational with critical approaches to literary inquiry. In his research, he applies quantitative and statistical and critical methods to exploring topics such as suspense in literary texts, the evolution of disciplinary writing styles, neologisms in science fiction, or short story in women's magazines. In his forthcoming book, The Afterlife of Aesthetics, he is shedding new light on the social work of aesthetics theory in the long 18th century. And here and today, Mark will speak about truth in climate fiction, communicating real-world facts through unreal words. So the floor is yours, Mark, and please use the chat to give comments, links, questions, and then after the talk, there will be lots of room for discussion.
All right, let's do that. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a long day here in this room, and I appreciate all of you that have hung on this long. So hopefully this will give you some kind of finale for the day. And thank you particularly for the invitation to come and talk to the seminar. I'm very excited to share this work with everyone. It's still relatively new research for me and for the group that I work with. And so your comments and questions and thoughts will be very much appreciated. And thank you particularly to the organizers of this seminar and of the conference to which it's currently attached, Franz, Giovanna, Benedetta, Will, everyone who's worked together to make this happen. I'm very excited to be here in such a beautiful location and to have the chance to talk to you about truth in climate fiction. What do I mean when I say climate fiction? Well, I'm opposing this to climate fact. And fiction and fact will become watchwords for much of what I'm going to talk about today. By fiction, I mean something like this passage from N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season, a book that will come up again later in my remarks today. Plants everywhere will die, and the animals that depend on them will starve, and the animals that eat those will starve. Winter will come early and hard, and it will last a long, long time. It will end, of course, like every winter does, and then the world will return to its old self. Eventually in this case, meaning a few thousand years. An evocative passage from Jemison, fictional and yet resonant, I think, with much of what we're facing today with climate change, as opposed to something that we might consider to be climate fact from the IPCC AR6 synthesis report published by the UN. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. Human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe, et cetera, et cetera. The core of this project that I want to talk to you about is the difference between these two things, the frisson where they meet. The places where they can be mutually informative and where they do different kinds of work in the world. This is research that seeks to examine not just how we are communicating about climate and its change and the dangers that we face, but the ways in which fiction, those of us in the world of the humanities and literary criticism, an object that we are very familiar with, the ways in which that object can do work within the real world to communicate information, as many would say, incredibly pressing and urgent information about the climate, and how it can sometimes do that better than scientific communication that's designed to do that very thing. And to do so, I'm going to dip into an area that's recently been called empirical eco-criticism. This is a relatively new term of art that's been studied. And I really like this term because of the way it situates those two things next to each other. Usually I'm very resistant towards the idea of that what I do as a digital humanist is empirical, because that seems to move it very much into a STEM field. But I think in this case, particularly around the issues surrounding science communication, empirical criticism does a really important thing, is it places these three different areas, the empirical, the ecological, and the critical, in an important relationship to each other, such that they can be mutually informing and really mutually co-constitutive. That is, we can use empirical metrics, as I will do today, to understand how eco-criticism is doing its work, but we can also use ecological and critical methods to think about the empiricism that's inherent in how we study, how we think about, and how we talk about climate change. And the real problem that I'm trying to get at the heart of this talk is that there has been a real concern about how effectively climate scientists are communicating not just the facts of climate change, but the urgency of climate change. As this quote from Bolson et al. In 2019 shows, despite overwhelming scientific evidence that this is a real thing and that it's happening, a significant percentage of, well, in this case, particularly Americans, which is kind of like the problem, do not believe that climate change is occurring, and they do not believe even more so that it is human caused. Contrast that with Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, who is the one credited with coming up with the idea of, or at least popularizing empirical eco-criticism. While few scholars could be so bold as to state in print that a literary genre could save the planet, the eco-political value of environmental literature has been a key subtext for the growing interest in climate fiction in liberal popular discourse. In other words, what we've discovered is that simply telling people facts does not do anything to increase their educative level. In other words, we don't change people's minds by giving them more information. What this talk interrogates is, can we change people's minds? Can we convince them of the importance of thinking about human-caused climate change, not by simply giving them facts, but by couching information within literary critical texts? Can literature, and I'm using literature here to stand in for media more broadly. Of course, we could do this with films about climate change. We could do this with other kinds of internet media about climate change. But in particular, I'm interested in literature and the way that literature works in the world. And so I'm really interested in discussing whether or not this new form of literature, what we're calling climate fiction, or what I will refer to throughout this talk as CliFi, because I also just really like the way that sounds, how CliFi can do work within the world to spread knowledge, to educate people, to do a kind of didactic function and work in ways that simple scientific communication can't. Now, of course, this is a tricky topic because climate fiction is by definition fictional. And if we have a problem on the other side of climate communication, it is that so much of climate communication is fictional in a bad way. I am, of course, referring to climate disinformation. And so how do we differentiate between real world facts that are couched within fictional worlds and fictional narratives and fictional facts that are couched within real world narratives? This is another point of intersection that I want to think about today. This is actually something that's already apparent within the discourse around climate fiction and climate fact. I'm going to refer you to a text that I'm sure none of you have read, The Simple Truth by J.A. Turley. It's a non-fictional book about the Deepwater Horizon climate disaster earlier last decade. That is the oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, which underwent a catastrophic disaster explosion and released millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf. A lot of was written about this, and this book aims to discuss what went wrong and how we might think about changing it. But it does so, I think, in a really interesting way. Now, again, this is a non-fictional work. And yet, this is a passage from that book. Jessica Firma's world exploded, not the planet, but the Deepwater Horizon, her $500 million drilling rig home in the Gulf of Mexico. The whole narrative that this book builds, which goes through all of the ways that regulation failed to lead to this disaster, is focalized through Jessica Firma, who is investigating this on behalf of the government. What's fascinating is that the author presents Jessica Firma as a real-world climate investigator until we get to the very end, when it's revealed that Jessica Firma is in fact a fictional creation of the author. Turley claims that Firma is a composite of many different people that did work investigating this. But the fact that he invents a single character to focalize this true narrative through as a way to do the work that he wants to do within the text, this is critical. There's a whole other project, by the way, for those of you interested in the gendered nature of these communications, of the fact that he invents Jessica Firma as a woman within this very male-dominated world, and why it's important that he focalizes the book in this way. I'd be thrilled to have that conversation in the Q&A. It's not what I want to focus on now, but it's worthwhile sort of pausing on. But the real point here is that already, even within narratives that were being published a decade ago, we have a kind of instinctive recognition on the part of the author that fictionalizing aspect of scientific communication does work in making this kind of communication possible. And as I said, this is very much in opposition to climate disinformation. Now, I want to define some terms here because I always find this really difficult to talk about. So when I talk about pro-climate change and anti-climate change, I don't mean people that are in favor of climate change. I don't think those people necessarily exist. I'd like to believe those people don't exist. I mean people, so by pro-climate change, I'm referring to people who believe that human-caused climate change is a thing and it's something we need to deal with. And by anti-climate change, I mean people who believe the opposite. As I've given you here from the reputable blog Count on Coal, that you can find online. This is a great example of climate disinformation and the way it works in the real world. And so another aspect of this project, as I suggested, is not just looking at how fictional narratives can communicate real-world fact, but how supposedly real-world narratives can communicate fictional facts. How does disinformation work, and how is that different from the kind of information that we might find in CliFi? And this is, as you can imagine, a difficult and messy question. For example, we don't just have to deal with disinformation in climate reporting, we have to deal with disinformation in climate fiction. This is, again, another novel we'll be seeing more of, Michael Crichton's 2004 book, State of Fear, which is, in all honesty, the only novel that I can find that is told from a conservative alt-right, well, what would now be considered alt-right perspective, that novelizes, as we'll see later in my talk, a brave group of climate skeptics who are fighting against these terrible eco-terrorists that are trying to inform the world about climate change. I was tempted to draw, by the way, the conclusion for part of this talk that it turns out Republicans just don't write novels, and I think there's something meaningful there, but unfortunately, I don't quite have the data to back that up yet. But it's a conclusion I'm willing to stand by, at least at this point. So I want to think about how climate disinformation works in the real world, and I want to think about how someone like Crichton, for example, can use climate fiction in order to communicate not real information, but false information, and how we might be able to tell the difference. And I want to think about this in a empirical, eco-critical way that is combining quantitative metrics and computational approaches to the texts, as you will see, with a critical eye towards interpreting what these models might tell us about what's going on in the novels that I'm studying. So the key questions I want to access through this talk, through this seminar, is how does climate fiction communicate climate facts within fictional worlds? And if there is a meaningful difference between pro-climate facts represented fictionally and fictional anti-climate facts represented non-fictionally. All right, clear? This will hopefully become so as we go along. So I think in particular, the tools of cultural analytics and digital humanities are a very good way of getting at this, particularly for topics as contentious, as sensitive, and as difficult and knotty as these are. Computational analysis of literature operates at scales that are traditionally unavailable to human readers. And this is going to be a really important point for what I'm talking about. And by scales, by the way, we're used to thinking about this in terms of the very large. But I think it's actually really important to think about this at both ends of the scale. That is, the very, very large. We can look at hundreds of novels, thousands of novels, millions of novels. We'll only be looking at hundreds today, but still more novels that a human can comfortably read within a limited time frame. But we also can use these methods to look at very small scales. Computational methods are capable of paying attention to the minute, the tiny, the unobservable at the level of reading that we have all become acclimatized to as human level readers. It can look for individual words and their reoccurrence and the way that those reoccurrences can be additive in ways that affect how we understand a text that we don't necessarily get from a critical perspective. But of course, we need to retain that critical perspective in order to bring those two scales together, as hopefully I will try and do today. Cultural analytic methods can focus our attention on these parts of the text that are particularly meaningful for our questions. In other words, the models that I will run today, I'm not anticipating will answer our questions. They won't answer my questions. I can assure you that by the end of the talk, I won't have answered my own questions, but I hopefully will have identified new questions that we can better use to be able to get at the things I really want to talk about in directions that we couldn't before. And patterns of language within text, I've already alluded to this, are tractable to computational analysis in ways that they're just not available to readers. And in early stages of this project, this is something that we used at. And I don't want to go too deeply into these early stages, but I want to give you just a taste to show you how I and my collaborators, by the way, I'm going to be speaking a lot in terms of the personal plural. I'm not taking a particularly regal approach, even though I am in Venice sitting in a very regal room. As I will acknowledge at the end of this talk, and I'm happy to do so at the beginning, the work that I'm presenting to you today, especially from this point onward, would not be possible without a really dedicated group of collaborators, particularly on this project, but also more largely within the collaborative group that I run, or that I direct, and that I'm lucky enough to work with, that is the Stanford Literary Lab. Both fellow faculty members, certainly graduate students, and undergraduates have all participated in this project in really important ways. So when I use we, I'm speaking collectively of all of those people. When you agree with me, you should give them all credit, and when you disagree with me, you can just blame me for that. So when we started off the project, we wanted to first begin by looking at just a very simple question. What's the difference between different ways of communicating climate information? In other words, if we have things like novels, like climate reportage, like scientific communication, and climate disinformation, how does the language within each of those genres work differently? And so we took a look, for example, at the different kinds of parts of speech that each one of these used. And more specifically, the named entity recognition software allowed us to look at what kinds of entities each one of these different genres tends to use. So here, each bar represents the entities that we have extracted from a corpus of fiction on the left, disinformation, newspapers, nonfiction books, and op-eds, newspaper op-eds in particular. And we were particularly interested in what disinformation is doing differently. So what kinds of entities, that is, what kinds of peoples, places, and things is disinformation interested in that other kinds aren't? And so, for example, we discovered that climate disinformation has a significant focus on money and frequently makes an economic argument. In other words, we shouldn't worry about climate change because it's going to cost us a lot of money to worry about it, and we don't want to do that. It's also very interested in focusing on, for example, percentages in ways that other forms of communication aren't. It's much more focused on relative measures as opposed to absolute numbers. And that's a way we think of fudging exactly how much of a change we're dealing with. When we dig into exactly what entities are being represented, these are the distinctive entities that disinformation uses. And here you can see, for example, a real focus on that economic argument. So that climate disinformation is interested in economics, tax, billions of dollars that it will cost us. And again, those percentages. Interestingly, it's also really interested in words like energy, gas. Sorry that the color makes this a little difficult to read. It's, I hope, better online. Electricity, power, and energy. In other words, they're not arguing so much, and this will be important for when we think about what the novels are doing in a minute. Climate disinformation isn't necessarily arguing that climate change isn't happening, although that certainly is embedded within the narratives. It's arguing that dealing with it will cost more money than it's actually going to be worth. Or if we deal with climate change, what are we going to do about our energy needs? Are we going to leave all of these poor people who need all of this energy out quite literally in the cold? And so from a simple, relatively quantitative analysis of the kinds of language that disinformation used, we wanted to see, okay, if this is what fictional representations of climate facts are doing within supposedly non-fictional narratives, what about fiction? What about this new genre of climate fiction, or CliFi? So step number one, we created a corpus of climate fiction. So we have 275 texts. All of them are novels that fall in some way under the label of climate fiction. And I want to acknowledge the work of our undergraduate RAs who made this possible, who parsed through hundreds of lists on Goodreads, on different internet forums, on eco-critical websites, etc., to assemble a list of 275 novels that are generally agreed upon by many of these lists to fall under this label of CliFi. And we found about 275 of them that we were able to get. They're all novels. Most of them were published in the last 30 years and in fact marketed as CliFi. There's a whole other aspect of this project I'm not going to talk to you about today, but I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A, where we look at exactly how these books are marketed. Those that are published more than 30 years ago, that's actually kind of interesting. We're not going to look at any of them, but they are recouped into climate fiction. So for example, Frank Herbert's Dune is in this corpus. It's a book published in the 1960s with a deep ecological focus, but well before climate fiction became a genre, but which has been retroactively adopted into that genre. They are a mix of genres. Some are realistic. There's a lot of science fiction, as you can imagine, within this corpus. There's some science fantasy, as we will see, a lot of dystopian literature. And that's one of the ways in which we'll witness these books work at the generic level. Most are pro-environment, that is pro-climate change, as I've defined it. However, a few, for example, State of Fear, that we've already seen, supposedly refute human-caused climate change. And so this is the corpus that we're predominantly going to be working with. But of course, if we want to see how climate fiction operates differently from other kinds of novels, we need something to compare it with. And so to do that, we drew a similar sample from the Chicago corpus. Now, this is a corpus of 9,449 novels written between 1900 and 2000 that were collected by the Chicago Text Lab. It's based on novels most frequently held by American libraries. Oh, and I should have said at the outset, and I will say here, that we're dealing predominantly, almost exclusively, with an Anglophone corpus. That is, we're dealing with works originally written and published in English. And of course, there's a really important multilingual argument to be made here, but at the start of our research, which is really where this project is, we wanted to simplify as much as we could, and sticking with an Anglophone corpus gives us the ability to do some kinds of modeling that would be deeply complicated in a multilingual environment, although that is something that we're looking towards. And so from the Chicago corpus, we drew a sample of the same number of novels, 275, that were equivalent in length to our client fiction corpus, and we drew them across the same time distribution. So hopefully what we have is a corpus of climate fiction and a corpus of non climate fiction. Now, we didn't do any work in terms of the genre of the reference sample from the Chicago corpus, which means that it contains probably a wider spread of genre than the climate fiction, of course, which is dedicated to one particular genre. But that gives us the opportunity to compare what's going on in climate fiction and its language with what's happening in all of the other genres. And so that's two pieces of the puzzle that lets us examine what we want to do. We have a corpus of 275 climate fiction novels. We have a corpus of 275 novels written around the same time that are not climate fiction. And then we have a really important data set. This is the climate fever data set. It's advertised as a data set for verification of real-world climate claims. It was published by a series of climate researchers, Diggleman et al., in 2020. And it's a really, really important data set for dealing with the language surrounding climate communication. It consists of 1,535 real-world claims regarding climate change, all of which were sourced from the internet. The researchers, Diggleman et al., had each claim evaluated by a group of researchers who were tasked with finding 5 manually annotated sentences from Wikipedia that either support the sentence, refute the sentence, or do not give enough information. In other words, every single sentence within this data set was evaluated as to whether or not it actually is about the climate, whether it contains supposed facts about the climate, and whether or not those facts are supported by the science, refuted by the science, or there's not enough information to decide. And this gives us a really important reference set of what real-world climate facts look like. Because what I really want to get at, and I will show you an example of these in a second, is how information is communicated within a novel. Now, in particular, I want to know how climate information is communicated within climate fiction, and that's the question at issue today. But a way of understanding my much larger research program is that I'm really interested with how literature communicates information differently from other ways of communicating information. Why, for example, when you want to communicate about the climate, when you want to tell people information, do you choose to put that in a novel or in a poem or in a play, rather than, for example, an essay or a textbook or shouting it from the rooftops? What does literature do to information that makes it a vehicle for communication? And so the climate fever data set gives us these real-world information claims such that we can use it to start finding information as defined by these sentences within our climate fiction corpus. Well, what do these climate sentences look like? They look like this. Here's a sample from the climate fever data set. Global warming is driving polar bears towards extinction. This is something that is supported by the science. The polar bear population has been growing. This, of course, is refuted by the science. And then at the end, you can get Earth about to enter 30-year mini ice age. This is a headline, not enough info. In other words, the annotators could not find enough sentences to either refute or support it. Mostly, I'm not dealing with the not enough info in the material that I'm presenting. I filtered this for the supports and refutes, particularly when we're interested in looking at whether or not the sentences that we found are supported or refuted by science. But it's important that you see that those exist. And what's interesting to me about these sentences is that they have a very particular form. That is, the sentences in the climate fever database or data set, we can think of them as referential, fact-bearing declarative sentences. And the facts that they bear are about climate, and that is important. But that actual form of the sentence is a really powerful heuristic, I think, for finding information in the novels. In other words, if we can use this climate fever data set to find sentences that in our novels that look like these sentences in the data set, then what we actually are doing is we're finding examples of information or things that appear to be information coded into the novel. So if the goal of this, one of the goals of this project is finding information in novels, if we can train a model to recognize climate fever data set sentences as opposed to other kinds of sentences you might find in fiction, then we can find sentences that look like that within our fictional corpus. So how can we classify a sentence like "the Great Barrier Reef is experiencing the most widespread bleaching ever recorded," which is what I want to find, against a sentence like "How is John today?" that we might find in a novel? How can we figure out the difference between those two things quantitatively, such that we can detect automatically climate sentences within novels? Well, the sentence I just gave you, "The Great Barrier Reef is experiencing the most widespread bleaching ever recorded," it's a declarative sentence. It's relatively simple. It contains an arguable fact about one or more objects or ideas, and it's about the climate or the environment. And so these are the kinds of sentences that we want to find within our two comparative corpora, the climate fiction and the reference corpus from Chicago. Now, there are a number of different ways to do this, and we tried a number of different ways. We extracted features from it, and we used different kinds of regression to train fairly simple models to see if we could recognize these sentences within our climate corpus. But in the year of 2023, it turns out that there's a much easier way of doing this. And so we turn to large language models, in particular, a bidirectional encoder representation from transformers, or BERT-based model. We used a language model based on BERT, but one that used contextual sentence embeddings. That is, the models that we're using are not comparing the distance between words within an embedding space. They're comparing the distance between sentences within an embedding space, which is why this is since the sentence is the unit of our investigation, it turns out that this is actually a really useful model to be able to think about what sentences are more like other sentences. The particular model that we used is based on a large textual data set, the Wikipedia and books corpus data set. And moreover, we did fine tune it to represent language relationships in smaller data sets. So in our case, in 20th century novels. So we have this model that's been trained, a large language model that we fine-tuned in order to make it better able to classify or to work with sentences like those in our novels. So what did we do with it? Well, we fine-tuned it, as I said, using our novel data so that it was more accustomed to the language of novels. And then we used TensorFlow to create a neural classifier that used our model embeddings to differentiate between whole sentences that are, on the one hand, like climate fever sentences, and on the other hand, like average sentences that you would find in novels. In other words, we trained a model to recognize, given a random sentence, is this sentence more likely to come from a novel, or is this sentence more likely to come from the climate fever dataset? This creates a model, assuming that it's successful, that can recognize, when given a sentence, that this is a sentence like the climate fever dataset, or this is a sentence like a novel. And happily, turns out it did work. In fact, it worked kind of astonishingly well. I should have probably written the number here, but if you take a look at the graphs, this is its training over 20 epochs, and it got really good really fast. The red is the training data, the blue is the validating data, and it doesn't really matter because in both cases, over 99% of the time, it was able to accurately tell whether or not a sentence came from the climate fever, so whether it was a fact-based sentence or whether it was a fictional sentence. And what this means is that when we turn this model loose on our climate fiction data set or on our Chicago data set, and it finds a sentence and it says, aha, this looks like it comes from the climate fever data set, it means it has a very, very strong intuition that this sentence that it has found looks very, very much like one of these informative climate sentences. And so its ability to recognize that does two things. One, we can pull out those sentences and see what they look like, as we'll do. But also, more importantly, we can just see in our two reference corpora, the Chicago versus the climate fiction corpora, which one contains more sentences that look like this. And hopefully it will come as no surprise that, in fact, the answer is climate fiction. Now, one thing to note here. Each bar here represents all of the sentences in our corpus. Turns out there's a lot of them. They're scaled here. There's about 2.5 million sentences in our corpus, in each corpus. And on the left, Chicago, these are all the sentences in Chicago, and on the right, these are all the sentences in our climate fiction corpus, and the color represents how the sentences were classified. Now, what you will notice is that overwhelmingly those bars are, I don't know, let's call it teal, blue or green, depending on how you see it. It turns out that most of the sentences in our fictional data sets are fiction, and that's good. If they weren't, I'd be really worried about how our model is working. So fiction mostly looks like fiction. Great. But the bars that you see that are colored in red represent the sentences found by our model that look like our climate fever data sets. And what you can see is, although they are overwhelmingly the minority of sentences overall, there are way more in the climate fiction data set than in the Chicago data set. So hypothesis one, climate fiction contains more informative fact-bearing sentences than the average novel. Yeah, it turns out that that is the case. In fact, this is getting rid of all the sentences that the model classified as fiction and just looking at the ones that classified as these facts. You can see that there's a large disparity between what it found in the climate fiction data set and the Chicago data set. And for those of you keeping score, a Wilcoxon rank sum test of significance showed that, yeah, it's super significant in terms of its difference. So climate fiction uses more of these sentences that look like facts than average sentences. So this is one way in which climate fiction is already showing us that it is different than the average novel. But we can go deeper. We can take these sentences and we can say, okay, what differentiates the sentences that our model found that look like climate fever data set sentences from average novel sentences? This is the least interesting result, hopefully I will show you. It turns out that sentences that look like climate fever dataset sentences are mostly about the climate. If we just look at the semantics of the sentences, they contain words like climate, ice, global, world, new, years, carbon, change, earth, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of interesting things going on if we want to look at particularly what the semantics of climate change sentences are within novels. But this does show that our model is very good at detecting sentences that are fact-based sentences about climate change. These, by the way, are the sentences that are the words that are most representative of our fiction corpus, or they're most significantly present in our fiction corpus. And this is just a lexicon of novels. A lot of personal pronouns. For example, words having to do with embodiment, of motion. Doors are really important in novels. For those of you who are not aware of that fact, they're the most common noun outside of human relating nouns in novels, or the most common nouns representing non-human objects are doors. But what this shows us is that there's definitely a vocabulary of fact-based climate sentences and a vocabulary of novels. Like I said, probably the least interesting result. Slightly more interesting is when we look not at the words, but on the parts of speech information. So these are the parts of speech that are more indicative of fiction. And you can see pronouns. Interestingly, punctuation, this will become important for what I'm going to show you in a second. Verbs, fiction is more invested in verbs. Interjections, adverbs, and participles. These are the parts of speech that are more characteristic of fictional sentences versus climate sentence. Interestingly, what's not surprising is that climate sentences have more nouns and more numbers. Much more interesting to me is that they have more adjectives. That I was not expecting. I was expecting novels to be much more adjective-y. But it turns out no, actually, because of the heavy preponderance of nouns within climate-based or fact-based sentences, they have a lot more adjectives as well. They also have a lot more symbols, subordinating conjunctions, auxiliaries, and of course, more proper nouns. So this is an interesting way of thinking about what these sentences are doing when they're embedded in novels, surrounded by these fictional sentences. The reason why I suggested, by the way, that punctuation was an interesting result in that it's more determinative of fictional sentences is because there's actually a really interesting disparative length between fact and fiction. On the left in red, you can see these are, again, all of our sentences in our climate fiction corpus. That are fact-based, and all of the sentences that are fiction-based. There's millions of sentences. You can't quite see that because they're all within those two bands. But the difference in the height of the boxes show a really important result, which is that climate-based fact sentences are longer than the average fictional sentence, by quite a bit, actually, by about 10 words. So these fictional sentences are, or sorry, these factual sentences within fiction are laden with nouns, laden with adjectives, and longer. And those are all ways that our model is identifying what these sentences are, and ways that we can think about what they're doing. Now, we can use our model to show that climate fiction is more invested in including these climate fact sentences within it. And that itself is a really interesting result. In fact, it's the result I'm actually most interested in, that there's more supposed real world or things that look like real world information embedded within climate novels. But of course, the climate fiction contains one other really important data point, and that is for each of its sentences, it tells us whether or not the science supports or refutes it. So now that we've identified all of the sciences that look like these, or sorry, all of the sentences that look like these fact-based declarative sentences in our corpus, we can then classify them to see, okay, do they look like sentences which are supported by science, or do they look like sentences that are refuted by science? In other words, when climate fiction is inserting these sentences into their fictional worlds, do they look like science-supported claims about climate, or do they look like science-refuted claims about climate? So, step one, we needed to train a model. Again, we used our BERT-based sentence encoding model to recognize the difference between supported or refuted sentences. And it turns out that it was not quite as good at that. Whereas the other was way up around 99%. This does so with about 80% accuracy. This is difficult to talk about because on the one hand, when we're doing this work in literary studies, like finding an 80% accuracy is actually incredibly high. It just doesn't look as impressive as like the 99% accuracy that I got to show you already. But this means 80% of the time, our model does a good job at guessing whether or not a sentence that we feed it is supported or refuted by the science. And so we can use this model trained on the climate fiction or climate fever data set to take all of the sentences that we recognized as these fact-based declarative sentences within our climate fiction corpus and classify them as to whether or not they are refuted or supported by science. And we can do that in our climate fiction data set, and we can do it in our Chicago data set. And again, look at whether or not there's a difference. And it turns out that, yeah, there is. So here, once again, I'm showing you all of, so the height of each bar represents all of the sentences that are these fact-bearing declarative sentences, and the colors indicate whether or not they are supported or refuted by science. And in both cases, there are more sentences that the model guessed are supported than refuted. And it's a little difficult to see because of the disparity of the bars. So here they are again. This time, instead of the raw numbers, I'm giving you the percentages. A higher percentage of climate fiction declarative sentences are supported by science or guessed to be supported by science than in our Chicago corpus. So not only does climate fiction contain more of these facty sentences, it also contains more of these facty sentences that look like scientifically supported claims about the climate. And this is a really good window, I think, onto what climate fiction is doing, but there's only so much that we can get out of models at this scale. So the last move I want to make is to leave this kind of macro analysis and go deep into 3 novels in particular and see, okay, what are these sentences doing in these novels? And I've chosen these 3 because I think they represent 3 really important subgenres within our climate fiction corpus. First, we have New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson. For those of you not familiar with it, this is set in the near future. I hesitate to call it dystopian fiction. I mean, it is dystopian fiction, but it's not like everyone is dying dystopian fiction. It's a world in which climate change, as Robinson claims, it's a world in which the worst case predictions of climate change made by scientists now have come to pass. So it takes place largely in a New York that's mostly submerged underwater, and it deals with characters seeking to adapt to this new world, confronting the greed and exploitative capitalism that brought about the dystopia in the first place. So it's very much couched within a scientific prediction about the future. So it's science fiction, but very, very science-based. Compared, for example, to N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season, the first book of her Broken Earth trilogy, this is something that's called science fantasy. It takes place in a completely different world with completely different scientific rules, but one that is echoing the kinds of climatological factors that we are facing. It's just doing so from a place of fantasy rather than science. So science fiction, science fantasy, compared to, once again, The State of Fear by Michael Crichton. Set in what he claims is the contemporary world, of course. It was published in 2004, so now it's a world in the past in which Crichton is using this fictionalized representation to find, or to try and convince his audience that climate change is not a real thing. So in this case study, what we can do is we can take all of the sentences within all of these books and see how many are model classified as these declarative science or declarative fact-based sentences. And these are the results. So the height of the bar here, there's one bar for each of my three novels, Crichton, Jemison, and Robinson. The height of the bar shows how many sentences within the novel look like these fact-based declarative sentences. And what's astonishing is that Crichton is way out in front. Whatever Crichton is doing, he is really trying to use these sentences to do it. Now, it turns out that this is a little misleading when you actually dig into the novel, because Crichton's book contains an appendix. And that appendix is really just a soapbox at the end of the novel that he stands on for like quite a while and talks about why climate change isn't a real thing. He gives a lot of references and makes a lot of arguments. But if you separate that out from the story, you can see that the story is mostly fictional sentences with some of these these fact-based sentences, or the things that look like fact-based sentences, whereas the appendix is more than 50% of these fact-based sentences. So if we take out the appendix from the novel, it's still interesting that Crichton uses more of these fact-based sentences, but the disparity is not quite as high. And that's because I think Crichton is much more focused on delivering information about climate than the other two. If we imagine that CliFi communication is predicated on integrating information and fiction, then Crichton's really playing a different game with his novel that's really just a thinly disguised conservative climate blog. Robinson is less important than Crichton, but has many more sentences like these than Jemison. So these different subgenres are clearly doing different things with these sentences. But we can go even further, because now that we've identified these sentences that appear to be these fact-based declarative sentences in each novel, we can not ask how many does each novel contain, but more importantly, and I think much more interestingly, where do they occur in the novel? That is, we can take the novel, we can arrange it linearly, and for each segment, we can say, okay, and I'm using 100-sentence segments, just because it's much easier to visualize that way. How many of these segments contain these climate facts, or how many of these climate fact sentences are in each one of these segments? And spikes will show us where in the narrative these segments occur. So this, for example, is the plot of Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. The line traces from left to right the progress of the narrative. Each dot represents a segment of the narrative in order, left to right, that contains 100 sentences, and the height of the dot represents how many of those sentences within the 100 are these fact-based declarative sentences. And I've marked the ones that are more than one standard deviation above the mean as red to indicate, yeah, these are the places where we really find comparatively a lot of these sentences. And you can see there are a number of interesting spikes, but two in particular that are calling our attention. So these two instances, one about a quarter of the way into the novel and one just past the halfway point, is really where these fact-based declarative sentences occur in Robinson's novel. Compare that to Jemison. Now, Jemison, remember, had the fewest of all, but what she does have is packed into one particular place. Here at the end of the novel are all of her facty sentences. And there's a really interesting genre thing, I think, going on here, because we learn some really, really interesting things at the end. That is, the entire novel follows the journey of three different women protagonists. And at the end, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, I have to talk about this. We learn that they're all the same woman at different times, and that she holds a particularly special place within the apocalyptic narrative that Jemison's writing, and that it's up to her within the next two novels to save the world from the climate disaster that's coming, but that the facts about that climate disaster are all packed into a kind of expository narrative that takes place at the end. Now, Crichton, again, all over the place. Because he has so many more fact-based sentences, there's many more spikes with them. They are, by the way, if you compare it when we include, this is the novel without the appendix. This is the novel with the appendix. I've left everything else on the same scale except this. You can see that the appendix really just takes it to a whole new level. But what I think is really interesting about this is that even though there are more such spikes, they occur in discrete chunks. That is, these novels don't sprinkle in their fact-based sentences across the narrative. Instead, there are clear moments of the novel where this discourse of declarative sentences is being evoked. There seems to be little consistency as to what part they occur in. And in fact, when we look at the whole corpus overall, that tends to be the truth. But it does appear that wherever they occur, they're bundled together. The CliFi authors load fact-bearing sentences on climate into discrete areas of their text, whether near the start, potentially we could argue these are world building as they are in Robinson, or explanatory as they are in Jemison. There's an the intersections between fact and fiction happen at specific points in the narrative. Conclusion 1. Conclusion 2 is what happens when we take these sentences that we found and use our classifier to say, okay, are each one of these sentences that look like our fact-based sentences supposedly supported or refuted by the science? And when we look at that, we can see really, really interestingly that many of them are, but not in the way that we would expect. So again, each bar represents one of the three novels in my case study corpus. Crichton, Jemison, and Robinson again. The height is just a relative, all of the sentences that are these fact-based climate sentences. And the red area shows how many were judged by our model as being supported by science versus not. Now, interestingly, or unsurprisingly, it turns out that that many more of Crichton's sentences are not supported by the science, but we kind of knew that. That's what he's doing. More interestingly, is I would have expected Robinson is explicitly writing what he claims is a science-based narrative about what will happen. Many fewer of his sentences are supposedly supported by science than Jemison, who's writing science fantasy. So more of her sentences are supported supposedly by science than Robinson. So it's worthwhile going into these novels as a final gesture and seeing what exactly is going on there. So in Robinson, I've given you an example of a sentence that is refuted or judged by our model as being refuted, and one that's judged as by our model as being supported. So refuted sentence: the floods inundated New York Harbor and every other coastal city around the world, mainly in two big surges that shoved the ocean up 50 feet, and that in that flooding, lower Manhattan went under and upper Manhattan did not. Charlotte, this is a great example of a New York novel. This is where the river just takes over the whole city. Now, this is being refuted by the science, and I think what's going on here is that this is, in fact, a fictional claim. This is about something that didn't happen, and the model is recognizing that this may be something that will happen, but it is not a true fact about the world. But what is a true fact about the world in Robinson is that the sea was covered with broken plates of sea ice and much taller chunks of glacial ice, etc. So this much more evocative sentence, interestingly, is judged by our model as being true, because even though it coats it in a very fictional, aestheticized representation, it is saying things about the world in a declarative way that seem to accord with reality. Now, if we look at state of fear, this is a little complicated because Crichton is complicated. But if we look into this time, let's look at his supported sentence first. And he will argue that even leading proponents of global warming have publicly expressed doubts about whether it can be predicted, whether it is a serious problem, and indeed whether it is occurring at all. What's really interesting about what Crichton is doing here is this is a declarative sentence, but he's sticking that declarative sentence within this hypothetical modal construction, future construction, sorry. He will argue this. So it's supported because the fact that he will argue is not something that you can really do anything about in terms of scientific information, even if the thing that he will argue is in fact an anti-climate sentiment. So this is a strategy Crichton has for trying to embed these anti-climate sentences within the fictional world of his novel. His predicted refuting one is one that casts doubt on climate science. If you read some authors who say we find that anthropocentric greenhouse gases and sulfates had a detectable influence on sea level pressure, it sounds like they went into the world and measured something. This is, in fact, something that probably is supported by science. If you read authors who say that, it does sound like they went into the world and measured something. So his game, like I said, is different than the other two. He's using these hypothetical constructions that appear to be supported, but that one that, is true is refuted because it's mostly cast in the negative. What's interesting about Crichton is that much like the climate disinformation that I showed at the start, Crichton is not specifically making an alternate argument that, climate change isn't happening. Crichton is instead casting doubt on what the scientists are saying. Like I said, he seems to be playing a different game than the other two, which brings us to Jemison. Now, this one really interests me. The predicted refuted sentence. The world has changed too quickly and too thoroughly. Why is that refuted? Well, it's refuted because there's not really enough information there, I think, to make a judgment about. Now, again, this is me interpreting what the model is saying. This is the model drawing my attention to the sentence and me doing a more critical approach to it. But I feel pretty confident that what's going on with this sentence is that it's a strong claim, a very general strong claim, but without anything substantive to link to it. This is why it's more like the refuted sentences in the climate fever data set. That is, it's more like those sentences that come from disinformation that are just making vague general claims. Now, the supported sentence, in fact, as the lores tell it, once upon a time, Earth did everything he could to facilitate the strange emergence of life on its surface. This is a really interesting one because, of course, it's highly fictionalized. It does that most fictional of things in that it personifies the Earth. But it comes across as supported. It's attributed to a lorist. It personifies the Earth as the actor in the development of life. And yet, I think what's really interesting is that the facts are kind of right, at least, and here's the important part, and what gets us really to the heart of the matter, effective climate fiction, which I'm going to suggest to you this is, doesn't simply present facts within a fictional world. It creates fictional facts that echo real-world facts, and so sound to readers more true than some of the specifically factual information about future predictions. In other words, what Robinson is doing by taking climate facts now and projecting them into the future comes across to readers as more false because it sets up that dichotomy between what is true outside and what's true in the novel. Whereas what Jemison's doing, I think, is really, really important because she is creating fictional facts that echo real-world facts in a really important way, and yet are absorbed by the reader as true because they are true within the fictional world that she creates. And remember, she embeds these sentences within a very specific part of the novel. Jemison's work here, and I think we can extrapolate from this to say, from our conclusion so far, climate fiction in general has more of these information-loaded sentences, but deploys them in a really key way. It deploys them at specific moments of the text, and it does so in service of creating fictional facts that nevertheless embed real-world information in such a way that a reader who is already inclined by the removal of this fantasy world from the world in which we live to be more suggestible to these fictional facts. It creates these fictional facts that are aligned with real world facts that contain real world information. It allows the reader to take those, absorb them, and hopefully understand them as true in a way that simply presenting real world facts doesn't. So that's where we are right now with our project. Thank you so much for bearing with me through that. I want to call out a special thanks to my collaborators, Julia Brush, Aaron Hanlon, Mike Hill, and Yohei Igarashi. And especially, as I said, our undergraduate interns, Shuyun Lim and Sari Soka Schwartzhabel, who have done incredible work finding our data, helping us clean it, and doing this. And I'm really looking forward to discussing the project and our results with you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, bravo. So yeah, Peter says it, Peter Robertson, bravo. So thank you so much for this engaging and meaningful and urgent research and sharing these results of what looks like an excellent design of a research setting. So the floor is now open for questions, suggestions. I think.
Thanks for your talk, Mark. I'll take you up on your little seed to talk about the marketing. Specifically, when you mention the marketing of climate fiction in the last 30 years, I was thinking about like the packaging of novels, which is very image-based, and but I don't know if you meant that. So keeping that in mind, is there a textual element to what you're calling marketing that would lend itself to the methods that you outlined for us today?
Thank you for that. I'm always, I overran my time a little bit, so thankfully I had cut that out, but this gives me a perfect way to bring it back in. And here I really need to thank Sophie, because she worked on this aspect with me over the summer. And together we collected. So I love the idea of looking at the images, and I would love to do that. A visual classifier is a whole other animal, so we haven't gotten there yet. But we collected all of the marketing materials, specifically that given to the publisher, by the publisher to Amazon, about each one of these books, particularly the softcover publication, if it was available, and then if not, whatever we could find. And so in that marketing material, we were really interested in looking at the difference between things that explicitly referenced the novels as CliFi or environmental or something, and ones that didn't. The ones that sort of talked about a thrilling science fiction adventure and didn't mention the fact that there's a deep ecological theme. And we're still working on the analysis, but there are a couple of really interesting differences. Ones that are specifically marketed as CliFi talk about the planet, but they don't talk about the world, and they don't name the planet. So they will literally use the word planet, but they don't use the word world, and they don't use the word earth. And I'm not exactly sure what that's doing, but I think there's a discourse of climate change that has to do with the way that we refer to the thing that we are concerned about. The other thing that we found that is potentially more interesting is a deep gender disparity. Things that are explicitly marketed as climate fiction are more often written by women authors or authors who identify as female. And this is part and parcel, and so we're not sure how this is correlated or causal. They also contain more female characters that are referenced specifically in the marketing materials. And there seems to be a very strong gender disparity in that. And this goes back to that original thing that I showed on the fact that this male author created this fictional female narrator to focalize the novel through. There seems to be something in the fact that if you're going to market something as climate fiction, you are somehow better off doing it if you want it to sell through a feminized perspective. I don't know. This again is still something we're puzzling through, but those are the two big things that we found out so far about the marketing material.
There's a question from the audience online from Jana Kerk.
Mark, thank you so much for this presentation. I actually wanted to ask about the gender dimension because I was wondering, even though you showed us male authors, I know a lot of like women authors, so I was like wondering, you know, about that dimension and also how this corresponds to the characters. But another interesting observation is also, why do we have not so much climate fiction by climate skeptics? And is that then like, does it not exist? Is it easier or harder to find? And does that mean that maybe we need to focus much more on alternative media? Like you mentioned before, also blogs or other types of media. So, or is that something you also plan to do? Because I think for me, I would also assume, of course, that the most people who write about this, they are really concerned. So, or are there also the works that you're looking at, are they dealing with climate skepticism also in a kind of way? Thank you.
All right. I'm trying to juggle this so that I don't do that horrible echo thing. So if you can't hear me, let me know. But you're nodding, so I assume you can. Thank you so much for that question. That series of questions is absolutely excellent. And I want to start at the end, I think, and work backwards, or maybe start in the middle and work to the outsides. Because yeah, my original goal was to create two corpora of novels. One that both were climate fiction. One that was like climate change skeptical, and one that was like again pro climate change. And I set about trying to do that, and then I couldn't find any of them. I mean, I found Michael Crichton's State of Fear, and there's a couple of conservative blogs that I'm sure I have now on a number of watch lists for having parsed or not, where I found like one or two other examples that are in our corpus. But there's really not much. And so I think you could draw some interesting conclusions about the way that climate skeptics are trying to communicate information. Whatever they're doing, it's not through novels. And I don't have a strong theory about I have a strong theory about that, but not a well-supported theory about that, about the relationship between the alt-right and the arts. But there are cases, so in the same way that in Crichton's novel, there are villains that are, you know, pro-climate and his protagonists are anti-climate. In the non-Crichton, in the majority, there are definitely villains who are anti-climate change, or sorry, anti-climate, and protagonists that are pro-climate. And so those dynamics get reversed. And I think it would be really interesting, and what your question is inspiring me to think about, is that it would be really interesting to do like a study of the protagonists and antagonists of this novel. So how do authors of climate fiction that are pro-climate change, again, you know, trying to communicate the facts about climate change, how do they represent climate skepticism? Because that would be really interesting to compare, as you said, against the other ways that climate skepticism is actually being communicated through these online blogs, through these different forums that we did collect as part of that first experiment that I showed, but which I haven't actually done the work of comparing to this fiction. It gets messy when you're dealing with fiction that is trying to represent itself as nonfiction because its facts are bad, and fiction that is representing itself as fiction but contains like good facts, that is true facts. So that messiness is like made me shy away from it a little bit, but I think it's a really, really great area to think about. So thank you so much. I want to take your question and think about it.
We have a question here in the audience from Charlotte Lindemann. Yeah, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for that fascinating talk. I have a mini methodological question. I'm wondering about the sentence in this project. In a way, this is a project about sentences. And on one hand, that seems only natural because the sentence is the smallest formally integral unit we have. But on the other hand, you seem to be making an implicit argument that there is some relationship between the sentence and the fact, or the sentence as a unit of information. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, I was thinking about description. What if a novel said, the grass is green, period, 2 moons rose that night, period? Like, I don't know, does that count? Does the first sentence count as a fact? And anyway, curious to hear your thoughts.
I mean, offhand from the hip, yeah, I think that does count as a fact. The grass is green. Yeah, I mean, to back up, I would say you make a very good call there, which is that I am putting a lot of weight on the sentence as a unit of communication. I don't think it's coextensive with the fact, like I don't think facts are sentences, but I think sentences encode facts in a way that is important. That is, a fact can be like a noun phrase, for example, grass is green. That isn't just the sentence, but the way that the sentence embeds that fact within it does, I think, important work for communicating that fact within the novel. So in fact, really, there's another version of this that extends it, wherein I don't look at sentences within novels, but I look at like noun phrases and sentences, which I think would be really fascinating. The practical methodological answer is that the climate fiction data set is such a great resource, and it happens to be sentences, that was an easy argument for, you know, let's look at the sentence because we have this great resource that we can use to train the model.
We have one question from the chat. Oskar Jigit, so if you want to read or elaborate on your question yourself, otherwise I read it, and then we have the next question in the room.
Yes. Hi there. I can read it. I can read my question. Many thanks for this great study. I'm doing my PhD on a similar subject using a translation corpus on science fiction. And I'm noticing similar features in science fiction. And I want you, if possible, if you can compare it. For example, I think in most of the science fiction, we see that there are fictional facts which Lopanen identifies as irrealia, and there are realia, and realia is used as the basis for irrealia in science fiction. And from the traditional science fiction, we see that there are info dump sections in science fiction, and generally they are either at the start of the text or at the end of the text. And I think there's a question that we must ask: how much of this feature can be attributed to climate fiction, and how much of this feature can be attributed to the overall genre science fiction? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I will say, you're not the first person to ask me that question. I have a collaborator at the Literary Lab, and we're working on a project on science fiction world building. And that was the first thing that she asked me when I presented these results to her for the first time. And I think there's something to it. I mean, there is a large proportion of science fiction within this corpus, and science fiction is a really interesting genre to think about in terms of information, because it is very invested in simulating science. And sometimes that simulation is actually accurate. It uses real world science facts within a fictional world, much the same way that climate fiction does. And sometimes it really is simulated. For example, we'll get a highly technical description of how a hyperdrive works, which may be based in science, but isn't relating real world facts. And I think there is a relationship between the kind of world building we see in science fiction and the way in which these climate or these fact-based climate sentences are embedded within these novels. So, for example, this comes together in what hopefully I showed in Robinson, which is that I think that spike. In fact, when I went to the novel and read it, that peak of these fact-based sentences at the first quarter is science fiction world building. And because his novel is doing this work of trying to extrapolate from contemporary science, he's using these facts to do that work. And that is really important. And that is exactly true, that these two things intersect. And it's useful to think of them in terms of each other. Jemison, on the other hand, and this is why I was really interested in using these as part of the case study, she's doing something else. There isn't a world building info dump at the beginning in the way that we might find with so-called hard science fiction. She instead is taking different generic cues. We might be able to relate this to, say, for example, the detective novel or other kinds, or the adventure novel, other kinds of fiction that have these kinds of expository, explanatory sections at the end. But what she's doing looks less like science fiction, but it still contains this very narrow segment of the novel that it's deeply invested in having as many of these sort of fact-based sentences as possible. And so the difference there is where I feel like science fiction and the generic conventions of it take us some of the way there, and I think that's a really important consideration. But I think there's more than that happening. And part of the work that we honestly haven't done yet, that I think you are very good at pointing to. In fact, I'm right now engaged in tagging all of the novels of this corpus as to what their generic identities are. I think once we do that, we'll be in a better position to really dig in and say, okay, how much of this can be explained by science fiction generic conventions, and how much is this uniquely CliFi and doing something different? But it's a really important and excellent question. So thank you.
Peter, if you use your microphone, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was quite wonderful and revelatory, and maybe even revolutionary for me, anyway. And seeing this. I think also a sort of a superb model of how to put together a study like this. So, as I said, bravo. It leads me to a whole bunch of questions. One is that I share the concern about the sentence being something of a blunt instrument, and that sometimes the patterns you're looking for might be small in a sentence, and sometimes considerably larger in a sentence. And I'm sure that's something you mentioned the noun phrase thing, and that's something you're looking into. Also, I found myself a little distrustful of but I understand why you took the science-based database that there's with the 5 Wikipedia sentences and so forth. It's a wonderful starting point, but it might also have been a limiting point in terms of like I said, and that also raises the question of what do you do when there isn't such a convenient set available? How do you replicate that kind of result, and you don't have that sort of anchor of material to do your BERT training on? Which I love what you did with BERT, and I want my own BERT. So I want to consult with you, and you can tell me how to get a BERT. So, but I think that overall, that also leads me to another question. And I'm sure these are all questions that you're heading towards. Is that, and by the way, I think you managed to complicate fiction in a really beautiful way. And what you've done, I think, is convinced us is found some evidence that actually the best facts are fictions. And if you really want to move people, doing so through a story, which is a fiction. So what you've untangled yet again is the complexities of the relationship between fact and fiction. Excellent stuff. I'm wondering too that whether you picked out one really excellent example of facts that people don't recognize. But beyond that, of course, there's a whole world of these happening, particularly in the United States. So I'm wondering, and you mentioned online blogs there, and so there is an ocean of words out there. Election denial, let's just talk about that for a minute. Not to mention the collected utterances of one presidential candidate at the moment that one could mine for this kind of fact and fiction. So do you have some ideas about where you might go with that?
Thank you. Although, can I just, before I get to your questions, which are excellent, can I just say that, by the way, I'm so grateful that Peter's here and that he's asking me this, because in my own particular narrative as a digital humanist, I don't know if you remember, but you lie at the origin of it. I was my very first digital humanities project that I ever worked on was when I was a graduate student at NYU, and we did the Clerk's Tale as part of the Canterbury Tales project. I was those guys. Yeah, and Martha Rust, absolutely. So Peter's responsible for me sitting in a computer lab and reading 30 manuscripts of the Clerk's Tale and marking it up in XML, which was the first actual digital humanities project that I've ever done. So it all starts with you. This is all your fault, in other words. The fact that I'm in despair of all of my university professors. But your questions, absolutely. I agree, as I said to Charlotte, that the sentence is a blunt instrument in this case. I mean, there are reasons why I used it. It's a useful syntactical thing. The climate fever data set made it very easy. And it's easy to disassemble it if I want to go smaller or larger. And I think there is something important about the sentence, because I think, and I'm going to make a very strong claim here that I can't back up, but I want to do more research into it. And it's one of the things I'm interested in. I think there is something about sentences that translate across and between fiction and nonfiction that other units of the text don't do the same. I don't think it's a better or worse thing, but for example, you can't compare chapters to something else. And paragraphs get really hard because so many paragraphs in novels are wrapped up in dialogue and they're so short and whatever. Smaller, maybe. Noun phrases, as I said, I think that would be a really interesting place to go. But I think there is something interesting about the sentence as a kind of unit of information that works differently in these two different contexts, but still has a kind of identity in both that's recognizable and comparable. So I don't want to completely let go of the sentence, but I completely agree with you that I want to think critically about it. I think it's really important to think critically about it, and I don't want to stick with it. I do want to go smaller. I want to think about the noun phrase. In fact, this brings me to your second question: what would I do if I didn't have the climate fiction data set? We didn't have it at the start, and so I spent a lot of time thinking about how we can possibly access the ways in which information is being communicated. And I came up with a couple of different answers. Like I said, this is part of a larger research interest for me, which is how does literature communicate information, specifically information? And in fact, I just published in the summer the very first paper in the Wordsworth Circle that uses numbers or graphs of any kind. I'm sure they're rolling in the aisles. Because what I was really interested in was looking at how poetry, specifically 18th century and Romantic poetry, how it used, or how it tried to communicate concepts, and whether or not it communicated abstract, whether or not it built up abstract concepts by communicating lots of general or very concrete ones, sorry, or whether it communicated lots of general concepts, and by doing so built towards I'm mixing that up. Let me start again. I was interested in whether or not it communicated in a very empirical way, lots of concrete concepts that it put together into a very abstract thing at the end, or whether or not it communicated much more abstractly, which then built towards a very concrete example. And it turns out that it transforms over the period, at least that's what I argue. But I did that by not looking at the sentence, but by instead doing a really big study where I classified a bunch of concepts, following a couple of intellectual history models as either concrete or abstract, and then looked at how they were deployed, for example, through a big corpus of sonnets. And I would obviously do something different here. These aren't sonnets. But I think you could do something really different, especially, as you say, if we start with these great sources of disinformation that we have, right? Like you could take a big corpus, and we have a good corpus of like online disinformation, like conservative blogs. There's a great resource online called the Smog Blog that collects. It goes through and it finds statements made by conservative figures and traces back to the disinformation sources that they're from, where we've collected a lot of these information from. And so I think it would be really interesting to take those and take pro-climate sources, do a different BERT model that maybe didn't look at the sentence as a unit, figure out how to classify different kinds of things based on that, maybe noun phrases in that case, and then trace that into it. I mean, I think that's really important work that I haven't had time to do yet, but. Yeah.
Thanks again to our favorite presidential cabinet page. There are immense quantities of lexical. Washington Post has something like 30,000 political fact checks in there.
Yeah.
So there's a corpus.
Oh, yeah. That did the work of those scientists that sat and like said, this is refuted, this is supported. Just not about necessarily climate change, but yeah, good call.
Are you going there? Are you going to do that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I want to stick with climate change for at least the duration of this project, but in a larger way. Yeah, I think that would be actually.
We have two more questions here in the audience. Stefano first, and then Giovanna.
So thank you very much. Now moving away from climate change, and looking at this paper from my own personal experience. I'm teaching my public history module. I always teach a class on historical novels, and it's always interesting to reason with my students on alterations, and trying as much as possible to understand the reasons and the consequences of the changes, the alterations and the distortions. So, of course, after listening to your presentation and also seeing the amazing results you were able to get, and I can't help thinking it would be interesting to apply the same model to historical novels, and then finding out that then maybe there are more facts, more historical facts in historical non-fiction, in historical fiction rather than historical fiction. So this is, of course, is pushing your research in a different direction that is originally meant to go to. But I was wondering to what extent you think that your research and your model can be applied to different fields, and to what extent it would be possible to reach analogous results.
I don't know about reaching analogous results, although one would hope so, but I do think that's a fascinating question. And as someone trained in, I mean, originally my PhD's in, well, digital humanities, but also 18th century literature. I spent a lot of time thinking about historical novels. I think off the top of my head, and I will say I've done very little research to support this, but if I were going to hypothesize wildly, I would think that the genre question would become really, really interesting, right? Particularly with Anglophone literature. Historical fiction is deeply invested in like genres of realism, right? And here I'm thinking about the rise of the realistic novel. Wait, let me back up for a second and ask clarifying. Do you mean historical fiction like the genre historical fiction, like a Walter Scott, or do you mean like 19th century novels in general, or both?
That's an interesting question. Maybe both.
Yeah. Because I think 19th century novels in general would be wrapped up in this idea of genre playing a really important part. Because I think someone like Dickens does a really interesting job, because he's not concerned about climate change, but he is trying in many of his novels. I think Bleak House off the top of my head, to a degree, in Great Expectations, Oliver Twist. I mean, he's trying to communicate facts about the poor and about poverty in England in the mid-19th century, especially, you know, right around the time that they're revising poor laws, et cetera, within the fictional worlds that he's creating, in a way that I think is very analogous to the way that contemporary climate fiction authors are trying to communicate climate science. It's like, I think he's doing the same thing, but without some of the apparatus of, say, for example, science fiction that we had the question about earlier. So I think there is a way to adapt these models to historical fiction. And I'd be really interested to see what we get. But there, I think the genre question would become really, really important. Because I think comparing something like, for example, Dickens or Middlemarch to, say, for example, Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, where the status of the fact radically changes, and it radically changes from like the beginning to the end of the novel. I think we'd have to do work to think through what's happening, because I think those two genres deploy information differently. But I don't have any evidence for it, and I think it would be really interesting to find some and test it, because I think you could take that corpus and apply it to it. I have a BERT model that's already trained on a corpus of 19th century fiction, because we're doing a project on domestic space and trying to get it to find spaces. So I think it would actually be fairly interesting to take that fine-tuned model and try and create the same kind of classifier. Yeah, great idea. Thank you. Thank you. Joanna.
Mine was a similar question, but so let me tweak it a little bit. First, then some type of historical novel that comes to mind is more around the revolutionary period, when it's about ancient made-up worlds, though. So like all these novels about Pythagoras, that there is like they're presented as historical. They are all about the present, but of course, if they're set in at that moment point in the Italic past or the Egyptian past, it's really historical, but there is this problem of, well, no. But instead, I want to ask you again about adapting to others, but in a way that maybe it's about what's distinct about CliFi. I'm trying to think of 20th century other moments or topics where maybe you could find a similar, like did you, because I know that you think about novels in the lab so much, like in various 20th century types of literature. Are there other things that could be similar, apart from the fact that you don't have the sentence, fact-based sentence, but is there something about, like, I'm thinking of when I was reading things growing up, like about the atomic war, like, is there anything that compares remotely, or the Cold War, that could then give you this problem of two authors that are trying to communicate in very deliberately, very different, like, and what would they be?
So can I say I'm glad that you didn't have a chance to ask that first question, because the word that you didn't say was allegory. And that terrifies me. Because what you're talking about, I mean, it's not quite allegory. We could argue about this, but those especially revolutionary novels that, you know, take the contemporary situation but allegorize it to Greece or to Rome. There's a world of complex information communication there that has so many difficulties that I can't even begin to imagine. So I'm glad you didn't ask that, because I don't know what to do with that. Although I think it's actually really important. But your second question touches on something I'm actually really interested in, and I think is going to be a future phase of this project, which is that I alluded to this already when I talked about the fact that most of our corpus is born CliFi. That is, these are novels written as CliFi novels in the last, 30 years, but really most of them are written in the last 20 years. But there's a significant portion of novels that, CliFi didn't exist when they were written. And a lot of this has been a kind of recovery project where contemporary eco-critical researchers will go back and say, okay, well, here's this book. It was clearly about the environment before we had a language or a discourse to talk about it. But it's an important precursor. Because one of the things I'm really interested in, specifically in this project, is the development of CliFi, is the birth of the genre of CliFi, both because I think it's important for thinking about the work that CliFi is doing, but it also is a really interesting case study in generic evolution. Because it bears such distinct fingerprints of genres that it's based on. The fact that so much of this is science fiction, and many of these novels are borrowing strategies from science fiction novels, both in their approach to the kinds of facts they include, but also in their didacticism, right? Science fiction is, and again, I'm referring to Nicole Demura's work here, a deeply didactic genre. In fact, more so, I think, than climate fiction. So one of the things that climate fiction is doing is it's taking that didacticism from science fiction and mutating it and transforming it by combining it with the realistic novel in some cases, or the fantasy novel in other cases. And so tempering that, which doesn't appeal to all audiences. In fact, one of the things that in fact, Nicole argues in her dissertation is that science fiction is not a well-regarded genre in literary critical circles because we have spent so much time talking about showing instead of telling, that it's sort of denigrated because it is so baldly didactic. And what climate fiction is doing is it's taking that impulse to teach, to communicate, but cloaking it by combining it with other kinds of genres in a way that doesn't trigger that same kind of critical response to dismiss it out of hand. So I think doing exactly what you're suggesting, going into other 20th century genres and saying, okay, how are these like CliFi? I think is not just an important exercise in and of itself, but something that can help teach us how this genre was born in the way that it's doing.
If we're going to start having fun with genres, what would you like? What would you do with Catch-22 or Confederacy of Dunces or the like? Oh, yeah. Well, humor in general.
That's Humor. I was just I came here directly from a workshop I was at in Graz because I have a project that I completed on suspense literature, and the thing that I found is that humor is the enemy of suspense. Everything that worked to help us map how suspense works in novels like falls apart in Catch-22, particularly. Partly because, not because I don't think that novel's not suspenseful, but I think the way in which sentences, information, paragraphs are deployed within humor deeply complicates the models that we use to analyze other kinds of writing.
Absolutely, it does. Actually, I dispute your point about suspense. What a friend made to me ages ago, which I think is absolutely true, is that a joke and a horror scene work exactly the same way.
Yeah. Oh, I like
So I'm not so certain about
yeah,
that.
sorry, I didn't mean that comedy was the enemy of suspense. I mean that comedy is the enemy of the ways that we traditionally study suspense.
That's right.
Because it's there, but are the ways that we've evolved to, or the ways that we have created to examine it, whether computation or critical, don't take into account that.
Yeah, but the whole point of comedy is that it gives you a completely different meaning from the surface meaning, and it evokes a completely different reaction than the standard surface reaction. So you have to invert your models, maybe. I mean, an ironic anti-time change novel would be. I hope you didn't have one in your sample.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I do. But if one exists, I need to find it because I would just love to see what it does. Like, what does the model do with that? Yeah.
Okay, we are almost running over time, but I have also two questions, if I may. Maybe not the last one, so if there are other urgent questions. So one question is there, can you say anything about the impact? So does it make a difference, climate fiction? Is there any indication if it matters for those who want to address these issues? And the other question is, as soon as you publish your research, what about your data? So do you share your corpus, and do you share, it's a beautiful corpus, obviously, of climate fiction. Also the comparison corpus is very useful, and also the approved climate facts. So, I mean, somehow, if you then state the results, how do you then deal with your data?
Yeah. That's the second question is really important. And I will say, I mean, I might as well start with that one because it's a fairly easy answer. I mean, this is a question of some urgency right now because the laws are sort of shifting under our feet. So with this particular corpus, we made use of the newly minted, let me get all acronymy for a second. We made use of the newly minted TDM exemption to the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is the US law that makes it illegal for anyone to break copyright and extract the text out of published literature. But the Copyright Office just last year granted an exemption thanks to the tireless work of a group of lawyers working with the Authors Alliance at Berkeley, who are working right now to do the thing that you suggested. I'll get to that in a second. So the exemption exists now is that for the purposes of text mining, we can extract that as long as a number of complicated things are obeyed. It depends where we get the novel. We have to own copies of the novels, et cetera, et cetera. And at the moment, it unfortunately does not allow us to share. But I will say I am working with that group right now. In fact, I owe them a letter that I will be writing on the plane on the way home, talking about the work that we're doing because of the exemption, because they're trying to make it, they're trying to extend the exemption so that we will be able to share that data with other researchers, not just our close collaborators. I will say that we are allowed to share it with collaborators. So if you ever want to collaborate on a project, just let me know and I can give you whatever we have. For the moment, when we publish it, we will be publishing as much as we can, which will include all of the derivative data. So we will release the model. The climate fiction data set is available. The Chicago corpus is available through other avenues. It's not ours. And then the CliFi corpus, which we did create, we will be publishing derivative data from it. So not the full text themselves, but statistics about the text such that you could use it to recreate the models that we have. And then potentially, and this is where I've been talking to too many lawyers recently, like scrambled versions of it. So that's the answer, sort of where we are. More than you needed to know about the current state of U.S. copyright law. Sorry, can you remind me of your first question? Yeah, okay. That's why I wanted to do this project, because I wear many hats at Stanford, and in addition to being a member of the English department, I also bizarrely am a member of the School of Sustainability, because I work with students in the EIPER program, the Eminent Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources. And I've supervised 3 or 4 students who have come through that program, which was then grandfathered into the very questionable School of Sustainability at the moment. And of the students that I've worked with in EIPER, some of them do really interesting work in terms of like opinion mining for resource extraction, looking at how resource extraction influences local communities, particularly communities of color or indigenous communities. But 2 in particular, I want to call out Ann Siders here because she did really important work thinking through climate mitigation strategies, but also looking directly at, from a sociological perspective, how in fact climate fiction does a better job at communicating these kinds of real world information instead of climate facts. And in fact, I co-wrote a paper with another student, Emily Grubert, who's now an associate professor, I think at Purdue. She just moved. And we that's actually, she's the one, I should have acknowledged that. She's the one that found that fantastic nonfiction book on Deepwater Horizon, where it's all focalized to that fictional character, because she was really interested in exactly this question. Is there an impact of, does fiction have an impact that science communication doesn't? Which is all a very complicated way of acknowledging some of my sources and making a larger statement, which is that there's really important research that already shows us that simple science journalism is not doing the work that we think it should do, but media is actually picking up a lot of that slack. So there's been work on climate change movies, like climate disaster movies, as well as climate change fiction, that show that they are really better at changing people's minds. So they have like this outsized impact. People working in that space are doing really, really good and really, really important work. But, and I think this is really an interesting argument for the public-facing humanities, they are not literary scholars, right? So they can say that, yeah, it seems like climate change movies are doing important things in terms of convincing people of the necessity of doing something about climate change, but they are not interested in how it works. And that's where I think we can make an important intervention, where we as literary scholars or scholars of media can come in and say, okay, like, great that you found this. Let's actually look and see what's going on there, right? How is this happening? And that's really where I'm hoping that this project and hopefully lots of other projects like it will make some kind of intervention in a kind of public humanities way, because we already know this is the case. Now I think we can do important work of figuring out how it's the case.
Thank you so much, Mark. Next seminar is on the 29th of November. Alessandro Lenci will talk about digital humanities and computational linguistics, new challenges and perspectives. So we will be happy to see you back there, and everyone have a nice evening and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.